Hi everyone. Welcome to the Quo-Cast with a guest presenter this week. You'll see why in a minute. My name's Greg Harper. I've recently written a book on Status Quo in the 1980s, focusing on their 80s period. And that is relevant because this week we're interviewing the resident interviewer, someone who does so much for the fan base with his own podcast. We're interviewing Jamie today. Hi, Jamie.
Hi, Greg. This is very surreal.
Yeah, it's more surreal for me. Trust me. How's things? You all right?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks.
I suppose the first place to start is when did you first hear them? When did you discover Status Quo?
It was about 25 years ago in 97, 98. I got into a car with my dad one Saturday afternoon. And you have to think, I have a sister, and I would have heard all the big hits of the day, Boyzone, Spice Girls, S Club 7. So I get in this car one day, and I'm hearing dun 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 dun, and it blew my mind, especially as there were songs there like Down the Dust Pipe, In My Chair, Paper Plane, all different, but all the same somehow. And I didn't ask who it was. I just looked down, saw the CD case, and saw it was a bunch of images in a row, and there was a man with a guitar in the center. And that's what I remembered. And I went home and I said, I heard this music in my dad's car, and I don't know what it is. And all I knew was the images with the man with the guitar in the center. And they bought me some compilation with images down the side because it looks similar. And then after talking to my dad, he went, oh, well, that's Status Quo, that is. And the funny thing is, my dad's been a hardcore Status Quo fan basically since birth. His mother was a big fan as well. So, yeah, I sort of followed in the family tradition.
Can you remember what that CD was? Because I'm sure there's some collectors out there that would go, oh, that's actually the 1993 reissue of...
It had just come out in 1997, Whatever You Want, the Best of Status Quo. And that was it. And to me, as you got through the CD, because eventually my dad bought me this CD, and then later I got like Thirsty Work and things like that. And
big up the Thirsty Work.
Yeah, exactly.
We're the only two members of that fan club, I think.
I've spoken to a few, but yeah, the compilation seemed to change in the middle, and you'll know what I mean because obviously it starts with the two 60s tracks, and then you have all the 70s singles except for Accident Prone for some reason, and then it goes into like the 80s stuff, and of course the 80s stuff sounds completely different to anything else. So you're hearing like Rollin' Home and Red Sky and the like, and as a 7-8-year-old it just blew my mind. Absolutely.
That is quite young, isn't it? 7, 8. I was probably about the same actually, hearing stuff like Paper Plane again on my old man's like best of collection, you know. What do you think it is about the 80s stuff that attracts you so much as opposed to, you know, some of the earlier grittier stuff, if you like?
I think what happened was, obviously growing up in the 90s and discovering them from that point, you discover things like Thirsty Work, and then Under the Influence, obviously, and Don't Stop. I remember getting Don't Stop on video and into the 2000s. And then in the mid to late 2000s, I discovered the 1980s stuff while I was at college. So we're talking about In the Army Now, Ain't Complaining, Perfect Remedy, and I guess it has a connection to all the stuff I grew up listening beforehand. All that pop stuff, it was slightly more polished, and some may say slightly more inventive in some ways.
I would.
I think so. And so I guess, as I say, growing up in the 90s and hearing the stuff there, the 80s stuff is just a little bit closer to the stuff from the 70s, which I discovered in my teens, and again, blew my mind. I don't think there is a time when they don't. They constantly surprise me.
Yeah, I would agree with that, actually, I think. It's got his fingerprints all over it, and it Ross's fingerprints all over that 80s stuff. Him and Pip Williams, pretty important to the band's sound at the time. Do you think it's the production or the compositions or a mixture of both that you find so attractive?
I think initially it was the production, because I collect sort of Andy Bowen albums on the side, which is both easy and hard to do. Another Shipwreck from his album Good Advice is a great example of 70s disco that is both good and bad at the same time. Then going into Ain't Complaining and their version of Another Shipwreck, it was a revelation to me, because I was like, they've updated it to the point where it sounds like it belongs in a Michael J. Fox movie. And that segment at the end where they're repeating the lines from the first verse.
I love that bit.
And it's like, what on earth? Why was this not a single? And I realized there's a bunch of 70s fans going, of course it wasn't a single because of this, and this, it was rubbish. It's like, yeah, but to a pop market, listening to the Now albums of that period, things like Sly Fox, Let's Go All the Way, for example, all that sort of thing, this fits into that mold. And so a lot of those songs would sound quite good next to any other track from peak commercial 80s of that period.
Again, I use that track as an example all the time. I think I'm ready for the hate if people want to bring the hate on me here, but I genuinely think it's one of the best things they ever made, as from a compositional standpoint, and from a production standpoint. I love it. You know, Rossi's vocal on it is super clean, really well delivered. Compositionally and harmonically, it's so advanced. You know, I mean, you couldn't get any further from that sort of three-chord trick formula if you tried, really, unless you're getting into sort of free jazz. You know, it's full of interesting harmonic choices, and that's bound to a T, I think.
Yeah. I'm thinking of tracks like Confidence, for example,
yeah,
the Thirsty Work album. The Thirsty Work album, by the way, is full of... It's basically a musical album. It could be a musical because there's just so many like variations, and there's a little bit of a cappella and a little bit of kind of showbizy stuff, and there's just something about it. It's just musical. And I remember sending an email to their manager, about 5 to 10 years ago, going, I want to write this musical based on Thirsty Work. And fans thought I was mad, because to me, it's this story of someone who works in a bottling plant who wants to escape. That was the story I had in mind, and the way that sometimes if you think of them as characters, each song is like a different character. There's just something about it that I really like.
I agree that there's something about that album that is... look, don't get me wrong, every Status Quo album has its moments of... they all do. And I include Pile Driver and the Quo album in that, and the live album, and, you know, that because other than something like Thriller or Asia by Steely Dan, you know, there's very few albums that are consistently working at 100%. But Thirsty Work for me, I agree with you, is that there's something really attractive about the way it's produced and the way it's packaged even. Did you ever have it on vinyl?
I didn't. No, that's the one album on vinyl I haven't managed to get hold of, because I think it's relatively rare.
Is it? I mean, I don't have it either on vinyl. I've got it on CD twice, actually. But do you do that sort of collecting thing where it's, you know, every reissue, or?
I used to. I think at one point it was I just need to get the albums. So when I started doing that, it was the mid-2000s editions, the Tim Turan remasters, which were great. And then when they started releasing the deluxe mixes, I think the only one I've got is Rocking All Over the World, and that's simply because of that remix.
It's stunning, isn't it?
It's amazing. absolutely. The sonics that he manages to bring out of it is incredible. And I've tried to collect things over time. I've just started, thanks to a few people and thanks to doing this podcast, I've started to collect more vinyl. Simply because it's just nice to have them in the original format. And sometimes you hear things in a different perspective. I recently picked up the Rock to Drop album on vinyl, and I'm so used to hearing those extra tracks on the CD, and suddenly not having them, things like Nothing Comes Easy, the album just changes completely, and it sounds a little bit more by numbers, I guess, because it's things like 4,500 times that just lift it out of its already good thing
Totally
that
agree.
it had going.
Totally agree. I mean, again, I'm ready for the hate to come my way, but I think it's better than the original recording. The 91 version is far, far superior in a number of ways. You know, if people want to argue, oh, it hasn't got the magic, it hasn't got the whatever, fine. But if you're looking at it objectively, it's a far superior recording. The production's better, the playing's better. It's just better. How do you feel about those people, certainly in sort of forums and, you know, comments threads and stuff, that kind of hate on that 80s, 90s, and even now Quo, you know, not just the recorded output, but the live output as well?
I understand their concern, because I guess in some ways I didn't totally get the 70s thing until I went to see the Frantic Four live, and then suddenly it's like, oh, I see. I think they're entitled to their opinion. I think Quo is such a wide fan base of different kinds of people and places that nobody is right, but nobody is wrong. That's the most diplomatic answer I can think.
That was very diplomatic. That's I'm impressed with that, actually. I couldn't have come up with that myself. Because it's weird that essentially Status Quo are 4 bands, really. And I'm not just talking lineup either, but you've got that 60s era, which is, you know, so far removed from everything they're known for, with the exception of Matchstick Men and Ice in the Sun. And there are dedicated fans of that period of Status Quo. Have you come across these guys?
Yeah. I think I'm a member of the group on Facebook, and it surprises me, but it doesn't, because I see a lot of comments of people going, well, I liked it when it was this, but I didn't like it when they went all bluesy and rocky. And again, I can understand why, because there are some cracking tracks on those first 2 albums that maybe are a little bit appreciated. Things like Nothing at All, with that. Its orchestral arrangement, the way that they bring the orchestra in, and it's almost overloadedness. Just everything's packed in. And if it had been recorded 10 years later, they maybe could have separated everything out, but somehow this mishmash of everything just works. And I think it's the same with something like Mr. Mind Detector, where that should have been at the front of a spy movie. I mean, it's got like George.
Is that
Martin.
the one with the little bass solo at the beginning? Doom, 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 doom. Great bass playing on that.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's just the orchestra again, and it's like some kind of lost Beatles tune. And I think a lot of those, that's kind of what they're striving for. And it's kind of unfortunate that the quality of those recordings perhaps isn't as good as it could have been. You know, but then that was what Pi gave them to use, and, you know, the technology that they had at the time.
Yeah, I think, would you say that they are trend chasers, or that they ever were trend chasers?
Do you know, it's funny that normally the thing about Quo is they say, oh, they never follow trends, they never do this. And it's like, if all you've ever listened to is Rocking All Over the World and Whatever You Want and Down, Down, they don't look like trend chasers, right? But once you get into that 60s stuff and you hear they're trying to do this psychedelic thing, I often term it as sober psychedelia. Because that's kind of what it is. I mean, they were doing things like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds live, but then things like Sunny Cellophane Skies on record. And it's like they're, like with the Mr. Mind Detector thing, it's like they're trying to mimic something. And then obviously the mid-70s, that tracks like Down Down often get lumped in with the glam rock thing. Because that kind of thing, you know, the 12-bar thing was very big in the mid-70s. People like Slade, and then the less credible acts like Mud and Shawaddy Waddy, that sound was big, and Down Down slots right in the middle of that.
Yeah.
And you might even say that was somewhat of a, well, it is a fad, because I remember Down Down was played on the hit list on BBC One once for people to guess, and nobody got it. And that's pretty much an indication.
What?
It's a very particular time and place. And then the 1980s, this massive amount of production and technique and those gated drums and all the keyboards that came about. Quo are trend chasers, and sometimes they get it right. Sometimes it goes less than ideal. Sometimes it feels like they're about 5 years too late with some of their choices. I'm
totally
looking
agree.
at you, Aquostic. Maybe they should have done that about 20 years previously, around the time of Under the Influence. It may have worked, and it
was a big hit for them, though, weren't it? That maybe not the second one as much, but that first Aquostic record, that was a pretty big hit as far as album sales went, weren't it?
Oh, it was, and it prompted a question, because I know that year, I think most of the top-selling albums of the year were by what they term as vintage acts, which is, you know, and that album cover probably had something to do with its success, as well as the fact that it just reinvented a lot of those tracks. And I remember watching the Roadhouse gig on TV and seeing people on Twitter comment about the folky style of Whatever You Want, and it's like maybe you're seeing the actual composition rather than just this Quo free chord denim thing, because playing tracks like Na 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 live in front of a BBC audience is incredible. Is something you just couldn't have imagined.
It was a ballsy move, actually. It was a really ballsy, if you'll pardon the expression. It was quite brave of them, I think, to try something that stripped back and leave themselves wide open for a whole new broadside attack from the British public. But it went in their favour, I think. How do you feel about Rossi's claims that Rick wasn't on the Aquostic project in any capacity?
Now, I think, well, obviously he sang on it, but...
Well, apparently he didn't. Apparently. I think it's in his book that they essentially all of... Him and Mike Paxman apparently have got a pretty good impression of Rick Parfitt together, you know, for singing BVs and stuff. So the impression I got from the book, I don't know if it says it in as many words, is that essentially Rick didn't actually have much to do with that project at all.
And yet it felt like the idea sort of came from him. And you'd think he would be the perfect... I mean, he was always playing like ukulele and stuff. And so you'd think things like Rain, the way that they've reinvented that, I realise a lot of fans would have wanted the entire album to sound like that, me included. That would have been great. But yeah, those claims, I think those that have been listening for a long time will know Rick Parfitt when they hear it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of seeing behind the curtain, I suppose, you know, the backstage elements of their lives. Did you ever get the impression that Rick didn't really enjoy doing the, I don't know, promoting records and being that, I think he enjoyed being a celebrity, but did he enjoy, trying to find a way to word this, do you think he enjoyed doing projects like covers albums and acoustic things and, you know, essentially promotional campaigns that made them look more tame than perhaps they wanted to appear.
I think from what I've seen, what I've read, I think maybe he didn't realize it completely until the Frantic Four tours, when you're stood in front of 5,000 people and everybody knows the words to everything. And it's I was a Hammersmith. It was the loudest noise that I've ever heard at a gig. I think a little bit like Rossi often says, it's a job. I think maybe that's where Parfit was going for a long time. Oh, it's a job. It's just what we've got to do right now. And if he did feel like some of those things were less, then I feel sad for that, because one of my first exposures to seeing them was the Don't Stop video that went out. That was the first time I kind of saw them in person on the screen, because obviously this is pre-internet. Nearly, pretty much. So yeah, and hearing him sing things like Proud Mary, it's like that stage presence that he had was very, it made a big impression on me. So it is disappointing if obviously he felt like that, but I can also understand it.
Yeah, I mean, he liked being a rock star, didn't he? And because he was incredibly good at it. Probably.
You're not doing it right. Apparently Rossi says rock like that.
Yeah, he did. Well, name drop, clang. When I was talking to him for the book, he said this exact same thing to me, and about how he absolutely adored Rick's vocal in the early days. You know, he said the way he sang ballads and all them old songs, even the ones not on stage, just when they were kicking back or whatever. It really stirred Rossi in some respects. He really loved it, and I think back then their vocals were similar. Rossi sings a lot in head voice, and I think Rick was kind of doing the same. And then as soon as Rick started pushing his voice down to his chest, I think a lot of that blend kind of disappeared, if you like. And I'm not saying that means Rick's vocal was any worse for it, but I think it did affect the blend of the vocals, because Rossi just never sang that way, did he?
No, and I think that's where it was good in the 70s, where they had that third vocalist in Alan Lancaster. Some of Lancaster's vocals on things like Over the Edge are very underrated. Some of that performance, and again the stage presence, despite the fact sometimes in a band you don't really look at the bass player. No, with Alan, you wanted to look at him in the same, in a same but different way with Rhino. You look across the stage and they're each their own personality.
Yeah, I mean, they're very different players as well, Rhino and Alan, I think. Alan was quite a meat and potatoes player. And that doesn't mean he's, any less good. But Rhino brought a different background with him to the band. Totally different. Because all his career up to that point, he'd been a sideman, and still is a sideman to an extent. But he'd had to wear a lot of hats in the past, Rhino. He'd played on, jazz fusion records, and he'd played on, rock records and blues records and, all sorts. And he just brought a totally different background with him. And I think it suits Quo, personally. I love Rhino's playing with Quo.
At the time that he joined, it was just the right thing for them, because they needed to sell records. They needed to be in the moment. They couldn't kind of go down the road that they were going down back to back. I realized somebody asked me on one of the groups, and I will answer it right now, what my least favorite Quo album is. Obviously, Famous in the Last Century is up there, and in some ways Dog of Two Head for a different reason, several versions of Na Na Na, but back to back at that time, it's good, but it also has some of the same energy as Famous in the Last Century, where it kind of feels a little bit It's a bit. I don't know how to say this. Is the word uninspired, or is it they just weren't? It wasn't clicking.
I think it's the latter, personally.
Yeah.
I always had the same thing with my missus loves Let It Be. The album, the Beatles album, Let It Be, and I find it really hard to listen to because you can hear them all pulling in different directions, and it's not. You can hear the despair in the band, and I kind of associate Back to Back with that same thing, really. I don't think it's the worst record they ever made. Far from it, actually. There's some cracking tracks on it. Some of them from Alan, actually. Old Rag Blues, man. Like, what a track that is.
Yeah, I actually have a mild fondness for Your Kind of Love as well.
Yeah, same.
Which, for any other band, this is the thing with Quo. On some of their albums, if any other band had recorded some of the tracks they have, thinking of things like Accident Prone, even Someone Show Me Home from If You Can't Stand the Heat, or half the tracks on Rockin' All Over the World, some of the stuff a little bit later on, it would have been a big hit for somebody because the composition's always there. It's just sometimes the execution and the band's image at that particular moment in time, or the past image, it never ceases to amaze me how when a new album comes out, suddenly it's like it's the one following Blue for You. And it's almost like nothing else has ever happened since then, and they're like majorly disappointed. And it's like, but you have to take into account all this progression. It was never going to be Blue for You or On the Level.
No. What did you make of Backbone?
I liked Backbone. I listened to it so many times. I mean, maybe what tends to happen with Quo albums is they come out at really pivotal moments in my life and they seem to help shape it. I mean, when Backbone came out, I just got married, I'd gone on my honeymoon, all that sort of thing. And we'd taken a little bit of time out to go on trips and try things. So then, this album comes out and it's like this year couldn't get any better because there's a new Quo album out. I wasn't a big fan of Waiting for a Woman. I was a little bit bemused.
It's such a weird opener, isn't it?
It just seemed to me like they were trying to go, here is this version of the band, let's just bring in each element, and then like this moody thing, it sounds like Quo, but it's not Quo. And I don't agree with some people who say it should be remixed. I think it sounds fairly modern. I was just listening to Liberty Lane, actually, and it still sounds good. And it's funny how they probably now program it so that it sounds good through these smart speakers and stuff, a little bit like Rockin' All Over the World. So I listen to Liberty Lane for a smart speaker. It fills the room, and you can hear most elements. The best track on that album, although it's a bonus track technically, is Face the Music. I mean, Face the Music is possibly the best thing that they've done in 25 years.
Oh, that's a bold statement. That's a bold statement.
Well, yes, it is, but possibly since 20 Wild Horses. 20 Wild Horses, what a record.
That's incredible. It's one of the best things they've ever made. Certainly one of Rossi's best.
It's got this sort of jig thing going on, and I'm a great fan of like going. So I play guitar and I do a little bit of composition on the side, nothing major. I just do it for fun. I like to do this composition stuff, and I like reinventing Quo songs. Taking a Quo song and going, Rossi did it like this, let's try it with an orchestra, or let's try it a cappella, or let's try it in a completely different style. And something like 20 Wild Horses could be a folk act, it could be country, it could even be a pop song. It's just, there's just so many elements to it. Strangely enough, if anyone's wondering, one of the weirdest things I've ever tried to reinvent is a track called I Wonder Why from the Back to Back sessions, where I've like reinvented it as a slow orchestral ballady type thing.
Do you do that in Logic or GarageBand or Sibelius?
I use Mixcraft for that. I've been using Mixcraft for the last 10 years. And there's this great plugin, BBC Symphony Orchestra.
I use
which
that.
Is free to download. Oh, it's wonderful. And on the side, outside of Quo, I'm a big fan of like easy listening, and I often think a lot of their songs, if you just slowed them down a bit and just focused on the melody, a lot of those could have been sung by someone like Val Dunican. That's kind of, I know some Quo fans won't like that, but honestly,
they don't have to.
You slow down something like I Wonder Why, and all those little kind of, da 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 da, and transpose it to like a proms type orchestra, and I think it really works. I know that Quo did it with 20 Wild Horses in the proms, and hearing that orchestra play those lines that Rossi has
it's
written,
great,
and it's like, this really works.
It's funny how malleable Quo material is, actually. You're the only other person in the world that I know, other than me, that has done like nuts stuff like that. I remember I was mucking around with a friend of mine, and we started playing Margarita Time as a bossa nova, like a Latin style thing, and like arranging it in our heads with sort of flutes and clarinets and stuff, playing the jazzy little counter lines. And the other thing I've done recently is published. It's all about me, this, isn't it? Published a big band arrangement of Caroline. For swing band, as almost like a Count Basie type thing, and I'm surprised how well it works. And I think it's because the melodies are so good. I think with Quo, all right, some of the harmonic vocabulary is pretty straightforward, but the melodies are so catchy.
Yeah, I'm thinking of songs like Going Nowhere from Thirsty Work. I can't play piano. I can play odd chords and stuff. I'd love to work out like a slow piano version of Going Nowhere. I think that would really work, especially with the really simple motif on that guitar. You are right that a lot of those songs have this kind of just melodic thing, and really it all starts in the 70s with a lot of those tunes, especially on, like, people forget songs like Claudie and some of the stuff on the Level, which is my favorite Quo album of all time. It's maximum, isn't it? It's just full throttle the whole way, but it's not completely mindless. You kind of hear things, and I have met people who've gone, oh yeah, but you listen to like Bye Bye Johnny, and it's that thrashy thing I can't get into, and then they're like into like this like proper much heavier much heavier thing, and it's like, but this is like the progression of that,
I think the difference between Rossi and Parfit and Lancaster is that Rossi tends to use the whole scale. Rossi uses all 7 notes in the scale, and sometimes more. And Rick and Alan and Bob Young as well tend to limit they naturally want to sing pentatonic lines, which is great. Like that, Eric Clapton does the same. It doesn't mean it's any less worthy of attention. But I think because of Rossi's upbringing, listening to all that Italian folk music, and I think having a very broad range of influences, and him not being afraid to show them, I think he's definitely more melodic. He might not be as hard rocking, he might not be as, down and dirty and gritty, but I think melodically, Rossi's pretty out there, really, in comparison to some of the other composers in the band.
You only have to listen to his solo albums to know where the influences come from. Not so much the first one, because he didn't really have too much to do with that. He was mainly the voice. I happen to be one of the very few people who actually like that first one, because I love something that takes them out of that box that people put them in and then go, right, this is it. And it's kind of funny because the guy that made that album was very well known for like BBC soundtracks, and it's funny that that's kind of what it sounds like.
Was that Tony McInerney? Something like that, isn't it? Yeah, he wrote a lot of the material on that, didn't he?
He did, but arguably, even though he didn't write it, tracks like Blue Water are some of Rossi's best performances. I mean, you could play that to someone who doesn't like Quo, and there's a chance they might like it because it's just completely outside of the box. The other solo albums are a little bit more Rossi, and I realize some people have gone, well, it's very Quo light, and it's like, but it's a guy from Status Quo not being in Status Quo. What did you think it was going to sound like? There's always going to be elements. And I remember there was a bit in his book where he said he sat down with Rick and they both sort of listened to each other's solo material in 85. And it was basically two versions of the same thing. So, you know, you can take the man out of Status Quo, but you can't take Status Quo out of the man.
That's a very... I would agree there. I've never heard it quite put that way, but I agree, and I think they know that as well. I think they know that. I know it winds Rossi up when people say, "Oh, it's not Status Quo," and his exact words are like, "What do you mean it's not Status Quo?" You know, it's me and Rick and Alan. What do you mean, like back to back isn't Status Quo? It's us. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right there. I think there's a lot more Status Quo in them than maybe people are aware of. What do you make of Rossi's production?
I mean, it's changed over the years, hasn't it? I mean, obviously, not counting the 70s ones because they were a band effort. I think that Rock Till You Drop, for all its detractors, is possibly one of his finest productions, because it manages to update the sound while still maintaining a true thing. I mean, obviously it all depends on the people on the outside as well, like the engineer and stuff and what they put into it. I happen to really like his production. I mean, we're seeing it on things like Lee O'Brien's album, what he's capable of as a producer outside of that Quo mold. And obviously because he's playing on it, he does. Yes, that's right. This is me. Yeah, good. Yeah, so we're seeing what he can do as a producer. I loved his work on Paul Camilleri's album about 15 years ago. That was proper, you know, traditional bluesy stuff. And you saw the difference that actually he isn't the same for every artist, especially when he's producing himself, because obviously he recorded 2 tracks with Paul Camilleri that he then recorded himself, and the 2 versions are completely different.
One was Strike Like Lightning. What was the other one?
Crazy for You. Was
he really? Did he do that with Paul Camilleri? I didn't know that. I knew he did Strike Like Lightning.
Yeah, it's funny. He should write for people more, I think. But obviously, as we saw during the pandemic, one of the reasons why he started working with Lee O'Brien is because he suddenly had time to do that. Maybe one day when Quo wind down a bit, they will start writing things for other people. I mean, I'm sure someone said the other day on a forum that they actually write like library music on the side.
They do, yeah.
As a completely different thing. I didn't know that. Because obviously, you know, most of the time, if it's not flashed in front of your face, you don't see it, you know, because a lot of those things are anonymous, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah. And they're just picked up and used on an ad hoc basis. Yeah, that's interesting. You should bring that up about I'm writing for other people, because I think the quality of the songs does speak for itself. And there's some things that, like you say, Someone Show Me Home you mentioned earlier, or even Another Shipwreck.
Yeah.
You know, in the hands of another artist. Like, I always thought Billy Joel and Another Shipwreck would work great. You know, can you imagine that in the hand? It's got all Billy Joel's sort of hallmarks, certainly compositionally. You know, he'd absolutely slaughter that, I think, in a good way. What do you find that Rossi's production is very clean, like super clean?
It can be clean. And I know that some people hate that, but it isn't 1975. And the way they were recording it, I mean, John Eden said it, the way they were doing it before Rockin' All Over the World was basically, you know, they couldn't separate a lot of things. It was very packed, let's say. Whereas later they had a lot more control and it became a lot more polished. And that's what I'd liked about Rossi. His techniques in a lot of things has modernized as time has gone on.
He's no slouch, is he?
No.
He seems to be, like you say, he doesn't sort of just want to imprint his own style on a production. I think he lets the material dictate how he goes about it.
Yeah.
And Backbone's the proof. And the Lee O'Brien record as well, of course.
Definitely. Have you heard that new track? It's Not Real.
Yeah. It's the last track on the reissue thing, isn't it?
Yeah. I heard that, and my initial thought was, it sounds like a Rossi production that's already been, but I can't think what it was. And then I realised Bula Quo.
Yeah.
It's very Bula Quo. And again, 2013 was a really odd year for me. And again, Quo picked me up and put me into a better frame of mind, which is amazing. I don't know. They always seem to release something just at the time, just when you need it.
What did you make of the Bula project?
Initially, I thought it was a good idea. I liked the idea of a film. As I say, I wasn't having a great time. I just split from my partner a few days after attending a Frantic Four concert, because, well, for many reasons. And I then heard about Bula Quo, which was, you know, it was like, oh, Quo are going to be on the big screen. That's interesting. And then I heard the album, and again, there was just this like sunshine about some of those productions, especially Bula Quo. I mean, I remember Chris Evans going crazy for it because it was within the Quo mold, but it managed to go outwards and do something. And I think had there not been a lot of other things around that time, like the Hello Quo movie, the Frantic Four reunion tours and stuff, it might have been slightly bigger. Although I think the film, I want to do a special on the film at some point, and I want to be positive about it. But for this one episode, I will say I will be less than diplomatic about it. It's a great bit of fun, but it could have been better. The story, it doesn't really matter. Nothing really matters. I mean, the fight scene is great. I hate films that at the end they show you a montage of what you've just seen, because it almost takes you out of it. It's like, I wanted this to feel like a real thing. I think in hindsight, considering what happened 3 years later, the Rick dying in Fiji almost more than once now has a poignancy to it, and yet a slight distaste, even though at the time it was like, that's very funny. Especially his line of, I'm not going to die again in Fiji, am I? Is possibly one of the funniest lines in the entire movie. But yeah, it could have been better.
Yeah, it's I think, to put it politely, it's a bit of a mixed bag, the film, isn't it? I watched it once. I don't think I watched it twice.
I've seen it a couple of times. I watched it in the cinema because my local cinema of Bognor was showing it, and they have a thing over there where you pay like $2.50 to get in. And so I was like, well, it's $2.50. I was traveling from Rustington at the time, which is next to Littlehampton. It's down the road. And so I went to see it, and I remember walking in, and there's like 10 people. And I heard someone say, wow, this is like a porn theatre. Because it was the smallest one that they could find. And I sat in the middle. There was hardly anyone there. And I remember just being completely immersed in it. And I remember staying until the end because Running Inside My Head came on the credits. And everybody's left. And I'm sat there thinking, okay, the lights have gone up, but when am I going to hear Quo in a cinema again? So I'm going to savor every moment of this. And then the second time I saw it with my wife a few years ago. And she really liked it, and we kind of said, well, let's not get rid of it, because one day it might be our kid's favorite movie, because it's kind of one of those.
Yeah, I think it is kind of a kid's film. It's a family film, isn't it?
Sort of. I didn't like the blow-up doll thing. I thought that was slight. It was like, okay, I see where you're coming from, but as someone who's studied media and filmmaking and stuff, sometimes there are ideas that look great on paper, and then it happens, and it just doesn't fly well. I mean, they got John Lovitz. I mean, that was impressive.
Yeah.
I wonder whether he knew who Quo were beforehand.
I don't know. I imagine most of the budget went on his fee. But in fairness, the cinematography's okay. You know, some of the shots are lovely. They call it second unit shots. You know, all them. You know, they're quite nice. It's a good looking film. They're just not actors, are they?
Oh, it's a superbly shot film. It's you know, it's lovely. I mean, especially in HD, it looks incredible. It really shows off Fiji to its best. But you are right that. Well, these guys were in Coronation Street. They were a really big hit when they starred in 2 episodes for a couple of scenes. Let's give them 90 minutes. It does, as some people who transfer from TV to the screen, it just doesn't always work. And I know they were working on a second one, which I'm glad they didn't do.
Were they going to do that in India or something?
There was something like that, yeah. I think musically, on the album, the album was interesting. It had some interesting tracks on there. Who doesn't love Fiji Time? And I remember getting the album and thinking, where in the film is this going to be? And then being completely disappointed when it wasn't used the way that I thought it was going to be used. I was like, you know, Fiji Time is going to be on the plane or something, you know. Again, that song in itself would have sounded great in any other movie.
Is that the one that was originally written in French?
Yeah. I found that out very recently. Rhino is a very underrated songwriter when it comes to the Quo material. I mean, I realize he wrote a few songs with Rick, and those are excellent. Things like Lucinda, Obstruction Day. Obstruction Day.
This is me, of course, as well.
Yeah. But Obstruction Day doesn't get nearly enough praise. And I do wonder sometimes when he plays it in his solo show in front of an audience, people even realise Quo recorded it, considering it has never appeared on any deluxe editions.
I think that's the track. You know, on that latest live album, Charge, he plays a bass solo on that, doesn't he?
He does, yeah.
And it's a really good solo, you know. It's such a good solo. He's such a good bass player, but I don't think the standard 2-hour Quo set gives him much room to sort of push that side of it. He gets a little bit in the Oriental, doesn't he? Which he's been doing for a few years. But I'd love... Have you seen any of the footage of Rhino at Bass Day UK? You know, the bass guitar trade show?
I don't think I have, no.
That shows him off quite well, I think. He's a really good bass player. Really good bass player. Big influence on me as well. How much of an influence do you think the band have had on you musically then? I know you said you play a bit and you compose a bit.
At one point, literally, I think I woke up and I just thought about Status Quo during my college years. They were a humongous influence. And I'd get home and I'd be stressed about whatever. I was studying media at the time. And I'd just pick up a guitar and just Rick Parfitt it for like an hour, 2 hours, and just keep going. And luckily, I found some amazing like-minded people in 2007 on YouTube who also felt the same. And they have had a massive effect on me musically. And sometimes now I'm aware of the fact that at one point I was so obsessive I didn't think about anything else. I'd shoehorn them into everything. That now I try and because I do this podcast, I try to say, right, I'm going to put Quo back in the box for the moment and try and listen to some other things. And obviously they led me to so much other music before and after. Some of the stuff that Rossi grew up listening to, like the Everly Brothers. And for me, I have these kind of moments where I step away from Quo, and it's always one of many artists. It can be anyone like Buddy Holly, Jerry and the Pacemakers, even some of his contemporaries like Dave Edmunds from the 70s onwards. They have had a massive effect on what I listen to. And I do a lot of music reviews of like vintage stuff, and it's amazing how I'm constantly finding out where Quo came from musically. When you hear this stuff, and sometimes I get sent things from like the 40s, and you hear it and you think, wow. You know, there was one track in particular by the artist Jimmy Reed, fantastic blues guitarist. And there was one track in particular, I can't remember what it was, but I thought, I wonder if Rick Parfitt was hearing that in the crib.
Yeah.
Because it was like, you know,
it's definitely possible, you know, and I think a lot of the fan base choose to ignore that side of Quo. I mean, all right, the covers albums I know leave a lot of people pretty cold, including the band as well. I don't think the band are particularly pleased with them either. But, you know, going back, and I remember being a kid and listening to them and going, oh, well, what did the original one sound like? You know, and things like Claudette, you know, which wasn't I don't think was a massive record for Roy Orbison.
No.
You know, but you listen to the original, you go, oh, man, that's pretty good, actually. I know why they've at least wanted to give that a try. And it did kind of open your mind to some of the more obscure tracks. I knew things like Proud Mary, but I didn't know things like Sorrow or I Can Hear the Grass Grow, you know.
Or Johnny and Mary. Like,
yeah, I didn't know that either. And I think using those as a jumping off point to explore their origins, you know, and they came through at a time when the business has always been fickle, but even more fickle, you know, in the 60s. And, you know, they were probably being persuaded by their families, you know, oh, don't bother with that. Go and get a job with your dad or whatever. And to come up through that, and that the 60s and to a certain extent the 50s were a pretty rebellious time for young people, especially here and in the States. And getting to explore that back catalogue, listening to all those old early rock and roll records, Buddy Holly records, and you know, you get a feeling of where they came from, don't you?
Oh, definitely. There's so many artists that I discover every week where it's like, wow, you know, this has been a progression over time where Quo are sort of part of that journey. And it's funny how when I was at college, a lot of people would say, oh, all that music, all sounds the same. All the Quo stuff all sounds the same. And then you listen to artists from 10 or 20 years previously, and it's even more samey than anything Quo have ever put out.
And, well, not only that, I don't know if you've listened to the top 40 recently. I'm not saying all of it's bad. Some of it's quite listenable, but that all sounds the same. And they're different artists, and they all sound the same. I think there has become a time where there's a certain way of doing things, and in doing so, everything starts to have a very similar thing about it. Yeah, I think Frank Zappa explained that it's getting businessmen in instead of musicians into record companies is what's killed it, because they're not interested in taking a chance on anyone anymore. They're interested in making money, and they do chase trends. And as a result, we've ended up with the same trend for a while now. And it's a cash cow, and it keeps rolling. And Quo don't fit that.
I wouldn't entirely agree. I mean, all of those compilations
that's different
to release like every 5 years, and they have most of the same tracks on it, and then some like accessible areas are like, here is our favorite tracks, and then others like pictures is like, here's all the singles, and then you've got Accept No Substitute where they're like, here are our favorites again. So they and then this best of the noughties thing where half the tracks are from the 90s.
Yeah, I thought that.
I get it. I get what they're saying, because in some ways, I used to do a radio show called The Millennium Years, and I played music from 95 to 2005 because it's kind of seen as a very similar kind of time frame, you know, the sort of era. And so I get where they were coming from, mid-90s to today. But the thing is, in my estimation, I do another podcast called 90s and Noughties. And Noughties usually means 2000 to 2009. And then when a number of the tracks come from the last 10 years, you know that maybe somebody's misunderstood somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, that I was intrigued by this new thing, you know, with the re-recordings of Caroline. I know that got released the other day. And I think they've also done Rockin' and another one. And there's a couple of remixes from some Backbone tracks as well, aren't there? How do you reckon they're going to sound?
I hope they sound a little bit more full, perhaps.
They're Backbone tracks, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so, because I know some people commented about the drum sound. It'd be very interesting now. I remember when Rick Parfitt's solo album came out and he released two versions, one that was polished, one that was unpolished. And I wonder whether those tracks are going to sound like those, the unpolished ones, where it's got a little bit less shine on it. So, I mean, it's funny. There was a video that came out a while ago on Luke Hargreaves' YouTube channel. Wonderful channel. The work he does is astounding, well on it. From the heavy traffic sessions. And it's funny how people look at that video and they go, oh, Matt Letley's drums, oh, it sounds amazing, unlike on the record. And it's like, but what you're hearing is a video camera recording a public speaker, recording, you know, it's like several versions laid down. And so you're almost getting a live feel, unpolished in some ways. I don't really understand why people want drums to sound like they've had no production on them whatsoever. I don't get that either. Do you prefer the polished stuff or the raw stuff? I mean, to be fair, I think there is a bonus to all of it. I think all of it has its own merits. I like the sound on Rock Till You Drop, but I'm glad they didn't continue with that. I don't know, because what is polished and unpolished now? I think our ears have almost become so attuned to certain things that we could think that polished was unpolished. You know, like... Yeah, true. Who can tell the difference? I like to be duped. I like to... for the same reason I like the movies I like. It's the same reason I like the music I like. I like to be fooled. You know, it's the same reason I like watching, you know, magicians do close-up magic. I like that feeling of being fooled. And I think as a result, I'm more attracted to polished productions. When the Parfit album came out, I don't think I played the band's mix at all. I listened to it once and they're not that drastically different, to be honest, but no. I still preferred the polished one because I like that vibe. I like knowing that every little detail has been considered. I love that. All of those elements. I mean, that album was, again, it came at a really difficult time in my life. It was this kind of bolt out of the blue, really unexpected, and nearly every track on it spoke to me in some way. And I think at the time I just lost a relative, and so a track like Over and Out was like, oh my goodness, you know, I'm getting tears just thinking about it. That Rick Parfitt has gifted this song to the world that is like a loved one speaking to you, sort of thing, you know. The words, the first words to that song, you know, Over and Out, where have I gone? You know, haven't had contact in what seems so long, up here alone, all by myself. I'm up here like a book on a shelf. It's like, you know, I think sometimes Parfitt's songwriting does not get the credit that it deserves. That sometimes he seems to write from this really like deep place, and I think we saw it on a lot of tracks in the 80s, where you'd have like Rossi going, and then Parfit would just be like in the corner strumming a power chord going down that Bon Jovi,
trying to tear his soul out.
Oh, I couldn't, like, Overdose.
Yeah.
I mean, how is it that the verses of Overdose are so, like, harrowing, including the use of those synthesizers? That really brings it home. It's like some kind of, like, letter to somebody. And then Overdose, the chorus is quite happy in some ways, but, like, harrowingly happy.
Yeah.
It's quite astonishing, the amount of musicianship and cleverness in that record, and a lot of things like Man Overboard.
I love that.
Oh, I mean, to top it off, my A string's gone again. I mean,
such a good line.
It's like, I'm having a really bad day, and to top it off, my A string's gone again. Music is my life, and even that's telling me that I hate that I hurt. Oh my goodness. Yeah, Rick Parfitt's songwriting. I think the last time we saw anything like that was possibly on the In Search of the Fourth Chord album.
So what did he do on there? Hold Me, yeah. And he did all right, didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't listen to that album enough, to be honest. I put it on in the car the other week, and a couple of months back now, and I was pleasantly surprised at how good it sounded. And I remember when that came out, they slated the production of that. They absolutely slated it. There's nothing wrong with it.
I loved it.
It sounds nice.
I had a 1980s hi-fi at the time, and it worked. You know, it really filled the speakers, and there was so much excitement about Pip Williams coming back. And okay, there might have been some people going, oh, but he produced all the 80s stuff and Don't Stop, etc. And it's like, but his kind of polished really suits the band, and I do love it when they work with an outside producer. Working with Dave Edmunds on Red Sky, I get that Francis didn't like it because it sounded in his mind like ZZ Top, but let's be fair, in 1985-86 when they recorded it, ZZ Top were the dog's bollocks.
Yeah.
That was really on trend, and that was the thing about Edmunds as a producer. He was able to tap into a trend. He was able to take music from the past and say, we can respect what's already been and make it sound new.
I love them tracks on Army, the Dave Edmunds tracks.
Yeah.
Rhino told me recently, like, my head exploded. That's not bass guitar that he's playing on that. That's synth bass. That's Rhino on a Moog bass.
No.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Goodness. That might...
Rolling Home as well. Same deal.
Yeah. That might account for why it sounds so drastically different.
Yeah.
But that's what they were going for. I've heard him in an interview say that they were going for sort of an MOR kind of sound at that time. But to go back to In Search of the Fourth Chord, I think that particular time, that was when my fandom just blew up. I was absolutely obsessed with the band, and that album in particular was a great instigator of that. And the thing is, I'd already seen them on Corrie. We'd already seen them, get top 20 hits in the charts and on top of the pops and whatnot. But that album, because it was so different, and it was one of the first albums that I bought myself as well, I think. All these things, and I remember texting my dad on the day and going, haha, I got it before you. And he'd message back going, well, I didn't realize it was a race. So, yeah, that album in particular, and Tongue-Tied on the end with Bad News. I mean, if anyone says, oh, all Quo songs sound the same, play them those two songs and you've pretty much got it.
I remember my mate Anthony, he's a great player himself and big Quo fan, really into the Police as well, and the band that is, not the False. And we kind of raced each other home from college. put it on and like learned as much of it as we could. And he's like, "Oh, I've learned the first 6." And I was like, "Well, I've learned the last 6." And I remember at the time we used to like populate Ultimate Guitar website with like tabs and chords and stuff. A lot of them are ours, and I remember putting Tongue Tied Up, and I think we both put it up within a couple of hours of each other. And we both loved that track. And then when he did it live, really good, really good.
It was really unexpected to see him do it live like that. I remember you putting those tabs up because around that time I was really into playing the guitar. And as I previously mentioned, there were some people on YouTube, this is a crazy story. And I've told this one before, but I'll tell it again. So there was 3 of us. There was myself, Christopher Fernihue, and Joachim. And the thing is, we 3 would release like versions of us playing Quo songs on YouTube before it was a thing. And I would talk to Chris, and he would talk to Joachim, and we'd sort of go back and forth, and we'd go, "Oh, how do you play this, and what do you do with that?" And then as time went on, kept in contact with these guys, stopped doing the YouTube videos, went on to other things. And this year is the Status Quo fan club convention. I'm going as a podcaster and as a fan. Chris is in the band Dog of Two Head, who are playing. Joachim's in the band Sound of Status. That is... it's crazy to me that after 15 years, all 3 of us are going. I mean, I met Chris in 2013, and he met Joachim in 2013 in the pub at Hammersmith. But all 3 of us are going to be in the same room at once, and that to me is incredible. And that's the power of the Quo army, that we can all kind of be so separate and then come together. And it just so happens that 2 of those guys I used to watch play guitar on YouTube and go, I'm learning to play the guitar and I love Status Quo, are in 2 bands on the bill at the fan club convention.
Yeah, it's cool, isn't it?
Yeah. And in case anyone's wondering, no, I'm not getting up. I'm not. If anyone's playing I Saw the Light, I think I can manage that. I never quite reached. I just wanted to play. I never aspired to be Rick Parfitt. I just wanted to play those 3 chords or whatever and chug along to records. If anybody happens to be playing Need Your Love as well, I probably could manage that. But yeah, that is why I'm not in a tribute band. Mainly because I'd want to be playing tracks from Thirsty Work.
Same.
And yeah, exactly.
Maybe we should start one.
Well, maybe. Yeah, I think at one point, I ran a radio station at one point, and a record label guy said to me, "You need to choose whether you play the records or you play on the records," basically. And it was like, okay. So what about people like Rick Wakeman, who spend their time doing stuff on the One Show and then go home and record 20-minute solos on their keyboards?
Or Jamie Cullum, got the most successful jazz show in the country.
Yeah, exactly.
One final thing, I suppose.
Yeah.
Excited about the Heavy Traffic re-release?
I was excited, and then I realised there weren't as many demos as perhaps there should be. I happen to be of the opinion that live performances on the end of extended editions don't make it a deluxe thing.
No, I agree.
How many versions of Whatever You Want, Down, Down, and Rockin' All Over the World do we need on such things? I was expecting more demos. I mean, there must be demos from the Parfit camp. I mean, I've been thinking this for a long time. A lot of the demos that come out of those things were from Bob Young's library. Where is Alan Lancaster's library? Or Rick Parfit? Surely they had home studios and they recorded things themselves.
Alan was really prolific. Certainly after Quo, sort of late 80s, he was super prolific. Doing film soundtracks and library music and all sorts. There must be some hidden gems there somewhere. I'd love to hear them. I really rate Alan, as I suppose most Quo fans do. But again, a bit like Rhino, I don't think he was fully able to express the breadth of his ability within the constraints of an established band, you know.
No.
Well, I was just saying, I hope this has been all right. This is the first time I've done anything like this. But it's been great talking to you. Really cool talking to you. And hopefully we can do it again sometime. And have another catch-up in a similar fashion.